Dusk was settling over the quiet town of Willowbrook as four friends gathered in the dimly lit basement of Sean's house. The air smelled faintly of pizza and energy drinks, but the atmosphere was charged with something else entirely, adrenaline. "So, are we really doing this?" Jake asked, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a hint of uncertainty. "Of course we are," Sean exclaimed, spinning a flashlight in his hand. "It's just an old building. What's the worst that could happen?" Melissa rolled her eyes. "How about trespassing charges? Or, I don't know, getting tetanus from all the rusted junk in there?" "Come on, Mel," Sean countered, grinning. "Where's your sense of adventure? This is our shot at becoming legends. The place is a goldmine for ghost stories." The place was the abandoned Light of Hope Asylum, a crumbling psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. It had been shut down decades ago under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a legacy of rumors and horror stories. Locals whispered about inhumane experiments, unexplainable disappearances, and the eerie glow of lights flickering in the windows at night. Clara, sitting cross-legged on the couch, looked up from her phone. "You guys know that people have gone missing there, right? Like, for real. It's not just some urban legend." "That's exactly why we have to check it out," Sean insisted. "We'll go in, take some photos, record a few videos, and be out before anyone knows we were there." "Easy for you to say," Jake muttered. "You're not the one who has to explain this to their parents if we get caught." But despite their reservations, the group couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. There was something magnetic about the asylum, a forbidden allure that made their hearts race. It was Sean who had found an old blueprint of the building online, marking key points of interest: the therapy rooms, the patient dormitories, and the infamous basement where the experiments supposedly took place. By the time the clock struck midnight, their plan was set. Flashlights, cameras, and a backpack of supplies were packed and ready to go. As they piled into Sean's beat-up car and began the drive toward the edge of town, an uneasy silence settled over the group. The closer they got to the asylum, the darker the road became, as if even the streetlights didn't dare venture too close. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Clara murmured, staring out the window. Neither could the others. The car's engine sputtered as it turned onto the overgrown gravel path leading to the asylum. Towering trees lined the road, their bare branches clawing at the moonlit sky. The headlights struggled to cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating only fleeting glimpses of the derelict building ahead. "Wow," Melissa whispered as the asylum came into view. "It's bigger than I thought." The Light of Hope Asylum loomed before them like a decaying giant. Its facade was cracked and weathered, ivy clinging to its walls like veins on pale skin. Most of the windows were shattered, their jagged edges resembling teeth, and the grand entrance, once majestic, now sagged under years of neglect. Above the doorway hung a faded sign with peeling letters that read, "Light of Hope Psychiatric Hospital." The irony of the name wasn't lost on anyone. Sean parked the car a safe distance away, killing the engine. "All right," he said, trying to sound upbeat. "Everyone got their flashlights?" "Yeah," Jake muttered, flicking his on. The light wavered as his hand trembled slightly. The group stepped out, their boots crunching on gravel. The air was colder here, sharper, carrying the faint scent of mildew and rot. It wrapped around them, seeping into their clothes and their resolve. A single crow perched on the asylum's roof let out a guttural caw before flying off into the night. "This feels wrong," Clara said, shoving her hands into her jacket pockets. "Like we're not supposed to be here." Melissa glanced at her. "You're just psyching yourself out. It's just an old building." "An old building with a history of people going missing," Clara shot back. "Come on, guys," Sean interrupted. "Let's at least get to the front door before we start freaking out." They approached the entrance cautiously, their flashlights casting long, jittery shadows across the cracked steps. Sean tried the door handle, it didn't budge. He pushed harder, and the door let out a mournful creak before giving way, spilling them into a cavernous lobby. Inside, the air was thick and oppressive. Dust floated in the beams of their flashlights, and every sound echoed unnaturally, as though the building itself were alive. The floor was littered with debris, old medical charts, broken furniture, and a single shoe that seemed disturbingly out of place. "Okay," Melissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're in. Now what?" Sean pulled out his phone, switching to video mode. "Now we explore," he said, grinning. "Stick together, and remember, the creepier, the better. People eat this stuff up online." "People like you eat this stuff up," Jake muttered, but he followed anyway. The group moved deeper into the asylum, their flashlights sweeping over peeling wallpaper and tarnished brass plaques. Occasionally, they passed faded posters promoting mental health and wellness, eerie relics of a time when this place had been filled with life. Or, at least, something resembling it. As they entered a hallway, Clara stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" Everyone froze. For a moment, the only sound was their breathing. Then, faintly, from somewhere deeper in the building, came a low creak, like a door opening, or closing. "It's probably just the wind," Sean said quickly, though his grip on the flashlight tightened. "Old buildings make noises." Clara didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. They pressed on, their footsteps muffled by the layer of grime on the floor. Every creak of the building, every whisper of air seemed amplified in the oppressive silence, as if the asylum were listening to them. Then they reached the end of the hallway. There was a set of double doors, their paint chipped and peeling. Above them hung a sign that read, "Patient Intake and Processing." "Should we?" Jake asked hesitantly. Sean nodded. "Definitely." As he pushed the doors open, a sudden gust of air rushed past them, extinguishing Melissa's flashlight. She let out a startled yelp, fumbling to turn it back on. "Relax," Sean said, though his voice wavered. "It's just the air pressure." "Right," Melissa muttered, but her hands trembled as she clicked the light back on. Beyond the doors was a cavernous room filled with rows of rusted wheelchairs and gurneys. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, some overturned, their contents spilling onto the floor. Faint graffiti covered the walls, most of it nonsensical scribbles, but one phrase repeated over and over in different handwriting caught their attention, "They're still here." "What the hell does that mean?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. No one answered. They were too busy staring at the graffiti, the words seemingly pulsating in the beam of their flashlights. Then, from somewhere deeper in the asylum, came a sound that made their blood run cold, the faint, echoing click of footsteps. The footsteps echoed faintly through the dark corridors, growing louder with each passing second. The group stood frozen, their flashlights trembling in their hands. Jake's breathing became shallow, and Clara clutched his arm tightly. "Did someone follow us in?" Melissa whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. "No one followed us," Sean replied, though he didn't sound convinced. He glanced over his shoulder toward the way they had come, but the hallway behind them was empty, swallowed by darkness. The footsteps stopped. The group exchanged nervous glances, their breath fogging in the cold air. Then, as if on cue, a different sound filled the room, the faint rustling of paper. They turned their flashlights toward one of the overturned filing cabinets, where the scattered documents seemed to be shifting, though there was no breeze. "What the hell is going on?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. "Old buildings," Sean said quickly, forcing a grin. "They creak, they settle, it's nothing." But Melissa wasn't buying it. She knelt to pick up one of the papers, brushing off a thick layer of dust. It was a patient intake form, yellowed and brittle with age. The name at the top had been scribbled out in heavy black ink, but the notes in the margins remained legible. Subject displays erratic behavior. Unresponsive to traditional treatments. Recommend further observation and experimental therapy. She frowned, flipping the page. The same notes were repeated on several other forms, each one bearing the same cryptic recommendation. Experimental therapy? What kind of place was this? Melissa murmured. Not a good one, Jake said, peering over her shoulder. A sudden noise, like a deep groan, echoed from above them, as though something massive were shifting in the floors above. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the group instinctively huddled together. I think we should leave, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. We can't leave yet, Sean insisted. We haven't even made it to the basement. The basement? Jake hissed. Are you out of your mind? Something's clearly wrong with this place. Before Sean could respond, the lights of their flashlights flickered, plunging them into momentary darkness. When they came back on, Melissa gasped. The graffiti. It had changed. Instead of saying, "They're still here," the words now read, "You're not alone." Oh my God, Clara breathed, stumbling back. That wasn't there before, Jake said, his voice cracking. No kidding, Melissa snapped. Can we please get out of here now? But Sean was already moving toward the hallway. Look, I know it's creepy, okay? But that's what makes this so good. We're going viral with this footage. Sean, this isn't a game. Clara shouted, grabbing his arm. He shrugged her off. You can stay here if you're scared. I'm going. Reluctantly, the others followed. They moved cautiously through the hallway, their flashlights illuminating old medical equipment, faded posters, and more graffiti, each phrase more disturbing than the last. They're watching. Don't trust the shadows. Turn back. The words seemed to drip off the walls like blood, and with each step, the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, as if the building itself were bearing down on them. I feel like I can't breathe, Clara muttered, clutching her chest. It's just your imagination, Sean said, though his own voice wavered. As they turned a corner, they found themselves in front of a rusted elevator. The doors were slightly ajar, revealing a dark shaft that descended into the abyss. Looks like our way to the basement, Sean said, peering inside. You've got to be kidding me, Melissa said, backing away. But before anyone could stop him, Sean stepped into the elevator. The floor creaked ominously beneath his weight, but it held. He turned to face the others. Well, he asked. Are you coming or not? The group hesitated. Then, with a shared look of resignation, they stepped into the elevator one by one. As the doors slid shut behind them with a deafening clang, they were plunged into darkness. And then, the elevator began to move, downward. The elevator groaned as it descended, the rusted cables creaking under the weight. The flickering beam of Sean's flashlight barely illuminated the cramped space, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The group stood shoulder to shoulder, their collective silence broken only by the hum of the ancient machinery. How far down does this thing go? Jake muttered, gripping the metal railing tightly. Basements in old places like this were usually more than one level, Melissa replied, though her voice trembled. Storage, utility rooms, maybe even tunnels. Tunnels? Clara echoed, a note of panic in her voice. Just saying, Melissa said with a shrug, though her confidence faltered as the elevator gave a sudden lurch. The lights in the elevator flickered, then went out entirely, plunging them into complete darkness. Clara let out a small yelp, and Jake swore under his breath. Relax, Sean said, fumbling with his flashlight. It's just a power surge or something. These places are ancient. A few agonizing moments later, the elevator jolted to a stop. The doors creaked open, revealing an inky black void. Sean swept his flashlight across the opening, revealing a long corridor lined with chipped tiles and rusted pipes. The air down here was different. It was damp, heavy, and carried a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of their throats. "Smells like death," Jake muttered, covering his nose. "No kidding," Melissa replied, stepping cautiously out of the elevator. The others followed, their footsteps echoing unnaturally down the hallway. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness ahead swallowing their flashlight beams. On the walls, old pipes hissed and groaned as if protesting their presence. Occasionally, the group passed rusted gurneys and abandoned medical carts, their surfaces coated in grime. Clara paused beside one of the carts, her flashlight catching something shiny. She bent down and picked up a small, tarnished scalpel. "This place is a nightmare," she murmured, running her finger along the blade. "Don't touch that," Melissa snapped. "You don't know where it's been." "Neither does the tetanus," Jake added, trying to lighten the mood, though his joke fell flat. As they ventured deeper, the oppressive silence began to take on a new quality. It wasn't empty, it was charged, as though the very walls were alive and listening. Then they heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed from somewhere ahead, like fingernails drumming on metal. "What is that?" Clara whispered, her eyes wide. "Probably just water dripping," Sean said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No way," Melissa replied, shaking her head. "It's too steady. That's not water." The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It seemed to be coming closer. "Should we go back?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. "We didn't come all this way to chicken out now," Sean said, moving toward the source of the sound. "Come on." They followed reluctantly, their flashlights trembling as the tapping morphed into something more erratic. It wasn't just tapping anymore, it was accompanied by a faint whispering, like voices carried on a non-existent breeze. As they rounded a corner, their lights fell on a large, rusted door at the end of the hall. Above it, faded letters spelled out, "Restricted Area, Authorized Personnel Only." Sean reached for the handle, but Jake grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? Something's in there." "Exactly," Sean replied, pulling free. "That's why we have to check it out." He yanked the door open with a loud groan, and the group was met with an icy blast of air that reeked of decay. Beyond the door was a room lined with old restraints and strange, rusted machinery. In the center of the room stood a single operating table, its leather strap still buckled as though waiting for its next occupant. But it wasn't the table that made them freeze in their tracks. It was the figure standing in the corner. It was barely human, a gaunt, shadowy form with unnaturally long limbs and hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Its head twitched unnaturally, as though it were trying to focus on them but couldn't quite manage. Melissa's breath hitched. Is that a person?" The figure let out a low, guttural growl, its head snapping toward them with an unnatural jerk. "Run," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. Then the thing moved. It lunged toward them with an inhuman speed, its distorted limbs stretching unnaturally as it closed the gap. Sean let out a shout, stumbling backward, and the group bolted down the corridor. The sound of its pursuit was deafening, scraping claws, guttural breaths, and the pounding of their own feet echoing off the walls. When they reached the elevator, Jake frantically pushed the button. "Come on, come on." The figure was closing in, its hollow eyes glowing brighter. Just as it reached them, the elevator doors slid open, and the group dove inside. The doors shut with a metallic clang, cutting off the creature's blood-curdling scream. As the elevator jolted upward, the group collapsed against the walls, gasping for air. "What the hell was that?" Melissa choked out, her face pale. "Whatever it was," Sean said, staring at the floor, "it knows we're here now." The elevator ground to a halt with a metallic screech, jolting the group out of their stunned silence. The lights flickered ominously as the doors slid open, revealing a different corridor from the one they had entered earlier. The walls here were darker, the tiles slick with something wet, and the air was even heavier, filled with a stench that made their stomachs churn. "Where are we?" Clara whispered, clutching Melissa's arm. "This doesn't make sense," Jake muttered, staring at the unfamiliar hallway. "We're supposed to be back on the first floor." "I don't think this is the first floor." Sean stepped out cautiously, shining his flashlight down the corridor. The beam barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. "Maybe it's just another part of the basement," he said, though his voice carried little confidence. "No," Melissa said, shaking her head. "We went up. We all felt the elevator going up. Then how are we still underground?" Clara asked, her voice rising in panic. Jake stepped forward, running his hand along the slick wall. "It's like the place is messing with us. Changing." "Places don't change," Sean snapped. "We're just freaking ourselves out." Melissa shot him a glare. "Are you serious? Did you not see that thing? This place is not normal, Sean." Before he could respond, a sound echoed down the corridor, a deep, resonant hum, almost like a growl. It vibrated through the walls, sending chills down their spines. "What was that?" Clara asked, her eyes darting toward the source of the sound. "I don't want to find out," Jake said, stepping back toward the elevator. He pushed the button repeatedly, but nothing happened. The panel remained dark. "We can't just stand here," Sean said, turning to the group. "Let's split up and find another way out." "Split up?" Melissa exclaimed, her voice incredulous. "Are you out of your mind? That's literally how people die in horror movies. Do you have a better idea?" Sean shot back. "We'll cover more ground if we split up. Whoever finds something useful can come back and get the others." "No," Clara said firmly. "We're safer together." Another low growl reverberated through the corridor, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from all directions, as if the building itself were alive and angry. "Fine," Sean said, his jaw tightening. "Stay here and do nothing. I'm going to find a way out." Without waiting for a response, he turned and started down the left hallway, his flashlight bobbing with each step. "Sean, wait!" Clara called, but he didn't stop. Melissa sighed, gripping Clara's arm. "We can't let him go alone." Reluctantly, the group followed, their footsteps echoing ominously as they moved deeper into the corridor. The air grew colder with each step, their breath forming clouds in front of their faces. The hallway branched into two paths ahead. Sean stopped, turning back to the group. "Okay, now we split up. 2 go left, 2 go right." "No way," Melissa said, crossing her arms. "Fine," Sean said, rolling his eyes. "I'll go right." "Jake, you're with me." "Melissa, you and Clara take the left." "I don't like this," Clara muttered, but she didn't resist as Melissa tugged her down the left corridor. As the group separated, the oppressive silence grew heavier, broken only by the distant hum of something mechanical. Melissa and Clara's path. The two girls moved cautiously, their flashlights scanning the walls. The graffiti here was more erratic, with words scratched deeply into the surface. "No way out. He sees you. The shadows lie." "I hate this," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I want to go home." Melissa placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out. We just have to." Her voice cut off as her flashlight illuminated something on the floor ahead. A dark stain trailed down the corridor, leading to an open door. "What is that?" Clara asked, stepping closer. Melissa stopped her, shaking her head. "Don't. Let's just keep moving." But curiosity got the better of Clara. She stepped forward, peeking into the room. Her flashlight revealed what looked like a small operating theater. Chains hung from the ceiling, and in the center was a chair outfitted with straps and ominous metal appendages. "Melissa," Clara said, backing away. "We shouldn't be here." "I know," Melissa said. "Let's go." Before she could finish, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging them into darkness. Sean and Jake's path. Sean and Jake moved down the right hallway, their flashlights revealing more decayed medical equipment and disturbing graffiti. "What do you think that thing was?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. "Does it matter?" Sean replied. "We're getting out of here, and that's all I care about." Jake frowned. "You're not scared?" "Not even a little." Sean hesitated before answering. "I'm not saying it wasn't freaky, but panicking won't help us. We have to stay focused." Their conversation was cut short as they reached a room marked Records Office. The door hung ajar, and Sean pushed it open. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers half open and spilling papers onto the floor. "Maybe there's something in here," Sean said, stepping inside. Jake lingered in the doorway, shining his flashlight around. The room felt colder than the hallway, and there was an unsettling stillness to it, like the air had been sucked out. "Sean, I don't think we should." A loud crash interrupted him, coming from deeper within the room. Both boys froze, their flashlights trained on the darkness ahead. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered. "Yeah," Sean replied, gripping his flashlight tighter. From the shadows, a low, guttural growl emerged, followed by the sound of something dragging itself across the floor. "Run," Jake whispered, and this time, Sean didn't argue. Sean and Jake sprinted back into the hallway, their flashlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. Behind them, the dragging sound grew louder, accompanied by a guttural rasp that sent chills down their spines. "Go, go, go!" Jake shouted, his voice cracking with panic. They rounded a corner, skidding to a halt as they reached a dead end. Sean spun around, his flashlight shaking in his grip. The hallway was empty, the oppressive silence pressing in on them once again. "Did we lose it?" Jake gasped, his back pressed against the wall. I think so," Sean stammered, though his heart was pounding so loudly he could barely think. For a moment, neither of them moved, their flashlights scanning the corridor for any sign of movement. Slowly, the dragging sound faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie stillness. "We need to find the others," Jake said, his voice hoarse. Sean nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He turned his flashlight toward the wall, illuminating a doorway they hadn't noticed before. Above it, a tarnished plaque read, "Patient Records." "This might have answers," Sean said, stepping toward the door. "Are you serious?" Jake hissed. "We should be getting out of here, not digging around for clues." "Look," Sean said, his voice firm, "if we don't figure out what's going on, we're not getting out of here. This place isn't normal, Jake. We need to know what we're dealing with." Jake hesitated, then sighed heavily. "Fine. But make it quick." The room was cramped and cluttered, its shelves sagging under the weight of old binders and files. Dust motes danced in the beams of their flashlights as they stepped inside, the air stale and suffocating. Sean began rifling through a nearby cabinet, pulling out files at random. Most were unreadable, their ink smudged and faded with age. But one file caught his attention. The label on the cover read, "Project Lazarus, Subject 0. "Jake, check this out," Sean said, flipping through the file. Jake leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the brittle pages. The file was filled with clinical notes, handwritten in a scrawled script. Subject 0, male, age unknown. Admitted under emergency circumstances. Exhibits extreme aggression and resistance to standard treatments. Experimental procedures initiated. Subject shows heightened physical resilience and cognitive decline. Warning, subject appears to influence environmental phenomena. Unexplained occurrences noted in proximity to containment. Subject 0. Jake muttered, his brow furrowing. What the hell were they doing here? Sean flipped to the next page, revealing a photograph clipped to the file. The image was grainy, but it showed a gaunt figure strapped to a gurney, its face obscured by a crude metal mask. A handwritten note was scrawled beneath the photo, containment breached. Do not approach. Jake stepped back, shaking his head. This is bad. Really bad. We need to leave. Before Sean could respond, the room suddenly felt colder, the temperature plummeting in an instant. Their breath fogged in front of them, and the oppressive silence was broken by a faint, echoing whisper. Did you hear that? Sean asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though the words were impossible to make out. It sounded like a dozen voices overlapping, their tones pleading and desperate. Then the lights in their flashlights flickered and went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Sean. Jake's voice was panicked, barely audible over the growing whispers. I'm here, Sean said, fumbling with his flashlight. He smacked it against his palm, and it flickered back on, casting a weak beam of light. The whispers stopped abruptly. Jake turned his flashlight back on, sweeping it across the room. In the far corner, the beam caught something, a figure hunched over, its back turned to them. Sean, Jake whispered, grabbing his arm. We need to go. The figure shifted slightly, its head tilting unnaturally as if it had heard him. Slowly, it began to rise, its limbs contorting in ways that made Jake's stomach churn. Run, Sean said, his voice barely audible. They bolted for the door, not daring to look back. As they reached the hallway, a deafening scream erupted from behind them, a sound that was both human and not. Sean slammed the door shut, leaning against it as his chest heaved. What was that thing? Jake shook his head, his face pale. I don't know. But I think it's Subject 0. Meanwhile, Melissa and Clara. In the left corridor, Melissa and Clara were still trapped in darkness. They banged on the door that had slammed shut behind them, but it wouldn't budge. Melissa, what do we do? Clara asked, her voice trembling. Hold on, Melissa said, feeling around for her flashlight. She managed to turn it back on, casting a dim light across the room. The operating theater was even more unsettling in the faint glow. The chains hanging from the ceiling swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. The shadows they cast seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, as though they had a life of their own. We need to find another way out, Melissa said, pulling Clara away from the door. They moved cautiously through the room, their flashlights scanning the walls for any sign of an exit. In the corner, Melissa spotted a rusted vent cover. There, she said, pointing. We can crawl through. Are you serious? Clara asked, her eyes wide. Do you have a better idea? Reluctantly, Clara helped Melissa pry the vent cover off, the metal screeching loudly as they worked. Once it was loose, Melissa climbed inside, motioning for Clara to follow. As they crawled through the narrow, suffocating vent, they heard the sound of chains rattling behind them. Something was following. The cold metal of the vent pressed against Melissa's hands and knees as she crawled forward, her flashlight casting jittery beams in a confined space. Clara followed close behind, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The sound of rattling chains echoed faintly from the room they had left, growing fainter but no less unnerving. Keep moving, Melissa whispered, glancing over her shoulder. We're almost out. How do you know? Clara asked, her voice trembling. I don't, Melissa admitted. But stopping isn't an option. The vent narrowed, forcing them to slow their pace. Melissa's flashlight flickered, and for a horrifying moment, they were plunged into darkness. She smacked it against the metal wall, and it sputtered back to life. Finally, they reached an intersection where the vent branched into two paths. Melissa hesitated, shining her light down each tunnel. Both looked identical, stretching endlessly into the shadows. Left or right? Clara asked, her voice barely audible. Melissa bit her lip. Right, she decided. Let's go. They turned right, their movements slow and deliberate. The air in the vent grew colder, and a faint, rhythmic sound began to echo through the metal walls. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft thump, like a heartbeat. But as they crawled deeper, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a heartbeat. It was footsteps. Sean and Jake, the revelation. Sean and Jake stumbled through the hallway, their flashlights barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The scream that had chased them from the records room still echoed in their minds, its inhuman tone sending shivers down their spines. "We need to find the girls," Sean said, his voice steady despite the panic in his eyes. "And then what?" Jake snapped. "We're trapped in this place. That thing, it's not human, Sean." "I know," Sean admitted. "But we can't leave them. We stick together." They rounded a corner and found themselves in front of a large, rusted door. Above it, a sign read, "Experimentation Wing." "You've got to be kidding me," Jake muttered. "We're not going in there." "Do you see another way out?" Sean asked, pushing the door open. The room beyond was massive, its walls lined with shelves of medical equipment and strange machines. Tables with leather restraints stood in neat rows, each one stained with dark, rust-colored smears. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the faint hum of electricity buzzed in the background. On the far wall, a large glass observation window overlooked a dark chamber. Sean approached it cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the room beyond. "What is this place?" Jake asked, his voice hushed. Sean didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the observation window. Inside the chamber, a figure stood motionless. It was the same gaunt, twisted form they had seen in the record's photo, the figure known as Subject Zero. The creature's long, distorted limbs hung limply at its sides, and its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark. The crude metal mask was still affixed to its face, and chains hung from its wrists, bolted to the walls. "It's real," Jake whispered, his voice shaking. "That thing, it's real." Sean glanced at a control panel beside the window, its buttons and switches coated in dust. A single red light blinked faintly, accompanied by a warning label, "Containment status, compromised." "Compromised?" Sean read aloud. Before they could process the words, a loud metallic clang echoed through the room. Both boys spun around, their flashlights searching for the source of the noise. The chains on the creature's wrists were moving. Subject Zero's head snapped toward them, its glowing eyes locking onto the window. With a deafening roar, it lunged against the restraints, the chains groaning under the strain. "Time to go!" Jake shouted, grabbing Sean's arm. The two bolted from the room, the sound of shattering glass echoing behind them as Subject Zero broke free. Melissa and Clara, the shadow in the vent. The rhythmic footsteps grew louder, reverberating through the metal walls of the vent. Melissa paused, turning her flashlight behind them. The narrow tunnel stretched into darkness, but something was moving, something large. "Move," she hissed, pushing Clara forward. "I'm trying," Clara cried, scrambling to crawl faster. The footsteps were no longer just footsteps. They were accompanied by a wet, dragging sound, as though whatever was pursuing them was pulling something heavy along. Melissa's flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. Panic surged through her, and she fumbled for her phone, using its weak glow to light the way. The vent began to slope downward, forcing them to slide. The sound of their own movement drowned out the pursuing noise, but Melissa could still feel it behind them, a cold, oppressive presence that made her skin crawl. The vent suddenly ended, depositing them into a small, dark room. Clara hit the floor first, letting out a grunt of pain, followed by Melissa. "What now?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. Melissa shone her phone's light around the room. It was empty except for a single door, its surface scratched and dented. Above it, a faded sign read, "Quarantine Zone." "We go through," Melissa said, pulling Clara to her feet. She pushed the door open, and they stepped into a long hallway lined with glass observation rooms. Most were empty, their interiors coated in dust and grime. But one caught their attention. Inside was a series of medical sketches pinned to the wall, each one depicting a humanoid figure in various states of transformation. The final image showed a creature that looked eerily similar to what they had seen in the operating theater. Beneath the sketches, scrawled in jagged handwriting, were the words, "The experiment never ends." Clara turned to Melissa, her face pale. "I think we're part of it now." Melissa didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the end of the hallway, where a shadowy figure stood, watching them. Melissa's grip on Clara's arm tightened as they both froze, their eyes locked on the shadowy figure at the end of the hallway. It was motionless, barely visible in the dim light, but its presence was undeniable. What is that?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Melissa replied, her voice barely audible. "But we're not sticking around to find out." The shadow shifted, its outline flickering like a glitch in reality. Without warning, it began to move, slowly at first, then faster, gliding toward them with an unnatural, jerking motion. "Run!" Melissa shouted, yanking Clara toward the nearest door. They bolted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence. The air grew colder with every step, and the oppressive presence of the figure seemed to press down on them, clawing at their sanity. Melissa pushed open the first door they reached and slammed it shut behind them. They found themselves in what appeared to be an old operating theater, its walls lined with rusted medical tools and broken equipment. A single gurney sat in the center of the room, its leather straps worn and frayed. Clara stumbled to a corner, gasping for breath. What is this place?" Melissa shook her head, her flashlight scanning the room. "I don't know, but we can't stay here." Before Clara could respond, the room was plunged into darkness. The faint glow of their flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the air itself, leaving only a suffocating black void. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, barely distinguishable from the ambient hum of the building. But as the seconds passed, they grew louder, closer, until the room was filled with overlapping voices speaking in an incomprehensible language. Clara clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Make it stop. Please, make it stop." Melissa grabbed her, shaking her shoulders. "Focus. Look at me, Clara. We're getting out of here. Just stay with me." The whispers stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving behind an eerie, ringing silence. Melissa's flashlight sputtered back to life, casting a dim glow across the room. But they were no longer alone. The shadowy figure was there, standing in the corner, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, filling the room with an unbearable weight. Clara let out a strangled scream, and Melissa instinctively grabbed a rusted metal tray from a nearby table, hurling it at the figure. The tray passed through it as if it weren't there, clattering loudly against the wall. "We need to go," Melissa shouted, pulling Clara toward the door. They burst into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind them. The shadow didn't follow, but the oppressive feeling lingered, clinging to their skin like a second layer. Sean and Jake, the encounter. Meanwhile, Sean and Jake were navigating a different hallway, their flashlights illuminating more unsettling graffiti and abandoned medical equipment. "Do you think they're okay?" Jake asked, breaking the tense silence. "They're fine," Sean replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Melissa's smart. She'll figure it out." As they moved deeper into the corridor, the sound of static filled the air, faint at first but growing louder. Sean turned his flashlight toward the wall, where an old intercom panel hung loosely from its wires. The static was coming from the speaker, accompanied by faint, disjointed words. "Experiment, failure, containment." Jake stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "Is that a recording?" Before Sean could answer, the intercom crackled violently, and a voice screamed through the speaker, "Run!" The hallway lights flickered, and a loud, metallic clang echoed from somewhere behind them. Sean turned his flashlight toward the noise, his heart hammering in his chest. At the far end of the hallway, a large figure emerged from the shadows. It was Subject Zero, its twisted limbs and hollow eyes illuminated by the flickering lights. "Go!" Sean shouted, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him down the hallway. They ran blindly, the sound of Subject Zero's pursuit echoing behind them. Its footsteps were heavy and uneven, like a predator toying with its prey. "This way!" Jake shouted, veering toward an open doorway. They stumbled into a small office, slamming the door shut and barricading it with a heavy desk. The pounding of Subject Zero's fists against the door began almost immediately, each impact shaking the walls. Sean scanned the room, his flashlight illuminating a desk covered in papers and a single monitor that flickered weakly. On the screen was a grainy black and white video feed of the asylum's interior. "Look at this," Sean said, pointing to the monitor. Jake joined him, his eyes widening as he recognized the corridors on the screen. They were watching live footage of themselves, trapped in the office, with Subject Zero pounding on the door. "That's impossible," Jake whispered. Before Sean could respond, the monitor flickered and switched to another feed. This one showed Melissa and Clara, running through a different hallway, their terrified faces illuminated by their flashlights. "They're alive," Sean breathed, relief washing over him. But the relief was short-lived. The feed switched again, this time showing a room bathed in darkness. At its center stood a single chair, its leather straps undone, and behind it loomed a massive shadowy figure, its glowing eyes fixed on the camera. The monitor went dark. "A building that won't let go." Both pairs of friends found themselves trapped in the asylum's labyrinthine halls, pursued by forces beyond their comprehension. The walls seemed to shift and close in around them, erasing familiar paths and creating new ones, as though the building itself were alive. In the suffocating silence, one thing became clear: the asylum didn't just want them there, it needed them. The asylum seemed to pulse around them, its oppressive atmosphere growing heavier with each step. The air was thick and suffocating, and the sounds of groaning pipes and faint whispers followed Melissa and Clara as they stumbled through the darkened corridors. "Melissa, I can't," Clara panted, clutching her side. "I can't keep going." "Yes, you can," Melissa said firmly, pulling her friend forward. "We're not stopping, Clara. Not here." They had no sense of direction. The hallways all looked the same, with cracked tiles, rusted fixtures, and flickering lights. The only difference was the increasing frequency of disturbing graffiti on the walls. Phrases like, "No one leaves," and, "You're part of us now," appeared at every turn, their jagged letters seeming to claw at their sanity. "We're going in circles," Clara whimpered, glancing over her shoulder. "I swear we passed that door before." Melissa's knuckles whitened as she gripped her flashlight. "Then we'll try a different path. We'll find a way out." But deep down, she wasn't sure she believed that anymore. Sean and Jake, tensions rise. On the other side of the asylum, Sean and Jake sat slumped against the barricaded door, their breath ragged. The pounding from Subject Zero had stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. Jake's hands trembled as he gripped his flashlight. Why isn't it breaking through? It could have smashed that door in seconds. Maybe it's toying with us, Sean muttered, his gaze fixed on the monitor that had gone dark minutes earlier. Jake snapped, shoving Sean's shoulder. This is all your fault. You're the one who dragged us here. You and your stupid idea for viral content. Sean shoved him back, anger flaring in his eyes. You think I wanted this? You think I planned for this to happen? I don't care what you planned. Jake shouted, his voice echoing in the small room. We're going to die here because of you. The tension snapped like a wire, and the two lunged at each other, their fear and frustration boiling over. Sean grabbed Jake's collar, slamming him against the desk, while Jake swung wildly, knocking over a stack of papers. Stop it! Jake shouted. But Sean froze. It wasn't Jake who had spoken. The voice had come from behind them. Both boys turned slowly, their flashlights trembling as they illuminated the room. At first, it seemed empty. Then, in the far corner, a shadow began to shift. It was the figure of a man, hunched and gaunt, his face obscured by the shadows. His eyes glowed faintly, like twin embers in the dark. Get out, the figure rasped, his voice hollow and broken. You shouldn't be here. Sean and Jake backed toward the door, their flashlights trained on the figure. Who are you? Jake stammered. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if he were a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Run, he whispered, his voice cracking. Before he finds you. With a sudden, violent motion, the figure collapsed into a heap, his body dissipating into a cloud of dark mist that swirled and disappeared into the air. Jake stared at the empty corner, his chest heaving. What the hell was that? Sean didn't answer. He grabbed Jake's arm and yanked him toward the door. We need to move. Now. The asylum takes hold. Meanwhile, Melissa and Clara found themselves in a new part of the asylum, an area that felt even older and more decayed than the rest. The walls were covered in black mold, and the floor was slick with an unidentifiable substance that clung to their shoes. We shouldn't be here, Clara whispered, clutching Melissa's arm. I know, Melissa replied, scanning the area with her flashlight. They came across a large door with the words, Therapy Wing, carved into the wood. The handle was ice cold to the touch, and Melissa hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, the room was filled with rusted chairs arranged in a circle. At the center of the room was a tall, cracked mirror, its surface warped and stained. Why is this place like this? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Melissa said, stepping closer to the mirror. As her flashlight beam hit the glass, her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't right. Her reflection was smiling, its eyes filled with malice. Melissa, Clara said, her voice trembling. Your reflection. Melissa stepped back, her heart pounding. The reflection didn't move with her. Instead, it reached forward, pressing its hand against the other side of the glass. A loud crash interrupted them as the door slammed shut behind them, and the mirror shattered, shards flying in all directions. Run! Melissa screamed, grabbing Clara's hand and pulling her toward the opposite door. Sean and Jake, the fracture. Sean and Jake ran blindly through the corridors, the oppressive whispers growing louder around them. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. We're going in circles, Jake said, panic rising in his voice. Sean didn't respond. His flashlight caught a familiar door, the same door to the records room they had fled earlier. No, no, no. Jake shouted, pounding his fists against the wall. "We're trapped." "Calm down," Sean snapped, though his own voice wavered. "How can you be so calm?" Jake yelled. "We're stuck in this nightmare, and it's your—" Jake froze mid-sentence, his eyes wide with terror. "Jake?" Sean asked, turning to him. Jake's flashlight fell to the floor as he began to convulse, his body jerking violently. His eyes rolled back in his head, and a guttural scream tore from his throat. "Jake!" Sean shouted, grabbing his friend's shoulders. But Jake's body went limp, and he collapsed to the ground. When he opened his eyes again, they weren't his. They glowed faintly, like Subject Zero's. "Run," Jake said, his voice distorted and otherworldly. "He's coming." Sean stumbled back, his flashlight shaking in his grip. "Run!" Jake bellowed, his voice echoing through the corridor. And Sean did. Sean sprinted blindly through the twisting corridors, the sound of Jake's distorted scream echoing behind him. His flashlight flickered erratically, casting warped shadows on the walls that seemed to move with malicious intent. He didn't stop, didn't dare look back, until his legs burned and his lungs felt ready to burst. Finally, he stumbled into a large, open room. It was unlike the others, eerily pristine, as though it had been untouched by the decay that consumed the rest of the asylum. The walls were stark white, and the room was lined with medical monitors and dormant equipment. At the center of the room stood a massive, circular console. Its lights blinked faintly, and a single screen displayed a grainy blueprint of the building. "What the hell is this place?" Sean muttered, stepping closer to the console. The blueprint seemed to show the asylum's layout, but it was more intricate than he had expected. There were countless sublevels and hidden passages, many of which weren't accessible from the main corridors. One section of the blueprint was highlighted in red. Beneath it was a label, Containment Core. Sean leaned over the console, studying the map. The containment core was deep underground, accessible only through a series of tunnels marked Restricted. Beside the blueprint, a line of text blinked repeatedly. "Emergency protocol, all access must be terminated." He frowned, his heart racing. All access must be terminated. What did that mean? Before he could think further, a sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl from somewhere nearby. Sean froze, his breath hitching. Slowly, he turned, his flashlight sweeping the room. There, at the far end of the room, stood Jake. Or what was left of him. Jake's body was contorted, his limbs twitching unnaturally. His eyes glowed faintly, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You should have listened," Jake said, his voice layered with something inhuman. "You can't stop it. No one can." Sean stumbled back, his mind racing. "Jake, it's me. Fight it." Jake's head tilted unnaturally, his smile widening. "There's no fighting. There's only him." Before Sean could respond, Jake lunged at him with terrifying speed. Sean dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. He scrambled to his feet and bolted from the room, his flashlight clattering to the floor behind him. Melissa and Clara, a desperate gamble. Elsewhere in the asylum, Melissa and Clara had found temporary refuge in a small storage room. The walls were lined with rusted shelves, and the air was thick with the smell of mold. Melissa leaned against the door, trying to steady her breathing, while Clara sat on the floor, hugging her knees. "We can't keep running like this," Clara said, her voice shaking. "It's like the building is alive. It's not going to let us leave." Melissa knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're not giving up. There has to be a way out. We just need to think." Clara looked up, her tear-streaked face pale. "You think it'll let us go? After everything we've seen?" Melissa didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. As they sat in silence, a faint hum filled the room. Melissa turned toward the source of the noise and saw an old radio on one of the shelves. Its cracked speaker buzzed with static, and then, faintly, a voice broke through. Containment core must shut down. Melissa's heart skipped a beat. Did you hear that? Clara nodded, her eyes wide. Shut down what? I don't know, Melissa said, stepping closer to the radio. But if there's a containment core, maybe that's where this thing is coming from. Maybe if we shut it down, we can stop it. Or it could kill us, Clara pointed out. Melissa turned to her, determination in her eyes. If we don't do something, we're dead anyway. This might be our only chance. The plan comes together. Melissa and Clara found a faded map of the asylum tucked into a drawer in the storage room. It was old and stained, but it showed the general layout of the building. They traced their location and found the path to the containment core, a series of winding tunnels accessible through the lower levels. We need to get to the basement, Melissa said, studying the map. Clara hesitated. That's where it started, isn't it? That's where, it's waiting. Melissa nodded. That's why we have to go. A deadly convergence. As Sean ran blindly through the halls, he heard the faint sound of voices ahead. He followed the noise, hope surging in his chest. Finally, he turned a corner and nearly collided with Melissa and Clara. Sean! Melissa exclaimed, relief washing over her. You're alive. Sean gasped, leaning against the wall to catch his breath. Where's Jake? Melissa's face fell, and Clara avoided his gaze. We haven't seen him, Melissa said carefully. Sean's jaw tightened. He's not Jake anymore. He's something else. Melissa nodded grimly. It's the same thing that's controlling this place. We found a map. There's something called a containment core. If we can get to it, maybe we can shut it down. Sean straightened, his fear replaced by determination. Then let's do it. We're not letting this place win. The three of them set off together, following the map through the labyrinthine corridors. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to grow heavier with every step, and the whispers grew louder, filling their minds with doubts and fears. But they pressed on, driven by the hope that they might end the nightmare. As they approached the final staircase leading to the basement, a deafening roar echoed through the building. Subject Zero was coming for them. The roar echoed through the asylum like a thunderclap, shaking the walls and sending shivers down their spines. Melissa, Sean, and Clara froze at the top of the staircase, their flashlights trembling in their hands. The sound of heavy, uneven footsteps reverberated from the shadows behind them. It's coming, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heartbeat. We have to move, Sean said, gripping Melissa's arm and pulling her toward the stairs. Now. The three of them descended the narrow staircase as quickly and quietly as they could. The air grew colder and thicker with each step, and a faint, rhythmic hum began to emanate from somewhere deep below. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, vibrating through their bones and making their teeth ache. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a long, dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with thick, industrial pipes that hissed and groaned, leaking steam into the oppressive air. The hum was louder now, coming from a set of reinforced doors at the end of the corridor. Containment Core, Melissa read aloud from the faded sign above the doors. This is it, Sean said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. How do we shut it down? Clara asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Before anyone could answer, the heavy footsteps behind them grew louder. A deep, guttural growl echoed down the staircase, followed by the sound of claws scraping against the walls. It's here, Melissa said, her grip tightening on her flashlight. Sean grabbed the wheel on the reinforced door and began turning it frantically. Help me. Melissa and Clara rushed to his side, and together they heaved the door open. The moment it creaked wide enough, they slipped inside and slammed it shut, locking the wheel behind them. The room beyond was massive, its walls lined with glowing monitors and humming machinery. At the center of the room stood a large containment unit, an intricate web of wires and pipes surrounding a glowing, pulsating core of light. "What is that?" Clara asked, shielding her eyes from the harsh glow. "It has to be the source," Sean said, stepping closer. "The thing that's keeping this place alive." Melissa scanned the room, her flashlight catching a control panel covered in switches and blinking lights. "This has to be it," she said, rushing over. "Can you shut it down?" Sean asked, joining her at the panel. "I think so," Melissa said, her fingers flying over the controls. "There's a power override. If I can disable the core's energy supply, it should shut down the whole system." Before she could finish, the reinforced door behind them buckled with a deafening crash. Subject Zero was here. The monster arrives. The creature tore through the door, its massive, distorted frame filling the entryway. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, and it let out an ear-splitting roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the asylum. "Keep going," Sean shouted to Melissa as he grabbed a length of rusted pipe from the floor. "What are you doing?" Melissa cried, her fingers frantically working the controls. "Buying you time," Sean yelled. He charged at the creature, swinging the pipe with all his strength. The blow landed against Subject Zero's shoulder, but it didn't even flinch. With a single swipe of its elongated arm, it sent Sean flying across the room. "Sean!" Clara screamed, running to his side. "I'm fine," Sean groaned, struggling to his feet. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes burned with determination. "Just keep it busy." Clara grabbed a heavy wrench from the floor and stood between the creature and Melissa. She raised it defensively, her hands trembling. "Stay back," she shouted, though her voice was weak. Subject Zero tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. It lunged at her with terrifying speed, but Sean tackled it mid-charge, knocking it off balance. Shutting down the core. Meanwhile, Melissa worked feverishly at the control panel. The system was ancient and uncooperative, but she finally found the power override sequence. "Almost there," she shouted, her hands shaking as she typed in the final command. The room began to vibrate as the core's light pulsed erratically. A warning alarm blared, and the screens around them flashed with red text. "Containment breach imminent. System shutdown in progress." "It's working," Melissa cried. The asylum itself seemed to scream in protest. The walls groaned and cracked, and the floor trembled beneath their feet. "A sacrifice!" Subject Zero roared, its focus shifting from Clara to Melissa. It lunged toward her, its claws outstretched, but Sean intercepted it again, grabbing the creature by its arm and holding on with everything he had. "Melissa, finish it," he shouted, his voice strained. The creature flung him aside like a rag doll, but the distraction gave Melissa the seconds she needed. She slammed her hand down on the final switch, and the core's glow dimmed before vanishing entirely. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the asylum began to collapse. The final escape. "Run!" Melissa screamed, grabbing Clara and pulling her toward the door. They found Sean slumped against the wall, barely conscious. Clara hooked her arm under his and helped him to his feet. Together, they fled down the collapsing hallway, dodging falling debris and the crumbling walls. Behind them, Subject Zero let out one final, blood-curdling roar before the ceiling caved in, burying it beneath tons of rubble. The trio burst out of the main entrance just as the entire asylum collapsed behind them in a cloud of dust and debris. They collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air and staring at the ruins of the building that had nearly consumed them. It's over, Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. Melissa nodded, though a nagging doubt lingered in her mind. I hope so. The roar echoed through the asylum like a thunderclap, shaking the walls and sending shivers down their spines. Melissa, Sean, and Clara froze at the top of the staircase, their flashlights trembling in their hands. The sound of heavy, uneven footsteps reverberated from the shadows behind them. It's coming, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heartbeat. We have to move, Sean said, gripping Melissa's arm and pulling her toward the stairs. Now. The three of them descended the narrow staircase as quickly and quietly as they could. The air grew colder and thicker with each step, and a faint, rhythmic hum began to emanate from somewhere deep below. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, vibrating through their bones and making their teeth ache. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a long, dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with thick, industrial pipes that hissed and groaned, leaking steam into the oppressive air. The hum was louder now, coming from a set of reinforced doors at the end of the corridor. Containment Core, Melissa read aloud from the faded sign above the doors. This is it, Sean said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. How do we shut it down? Clara asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Before anyone could answer, the heavy footsteps behind them grew louder. A deep, guttural growl echoed down the staircase, followed by the sound of claws scraping against the walls. It's here, Melissa said, her grip tightening on her flashlight. Sean grabbed the wheel on the reinforced door and began turning it frantically. Help me. Melissa and Clara rushed to his side, and together they heaved the door open. The moment it creaked wide enough, they slipped inside and slammed it shut, locking the wheel behind them. The room beyond was massive, its walls lined with glowing monitors and humming machinery. At the center of the room stood a large containment unit, an intricate web of wires and pipes surrounding a glowing, pulsating core of light. What is that? Clara asked, shielding her eyes from the harsh glow. It has to be the source, Sean said, stepping closer. The thing that's keeping this place alive. Melissa scanned the room, her flashlight catching a control panel covered in switches and blinking lights. This has to be it, she said, rushing over. Can you shut it down? Sean asked, joining her at the panel. I think so, Melissa said, her fingers flying over the controls. There's a power override. If I can disable the core's energy supply, it should shut down the whole system. Before she could finish, the reinforced door behind them buckled with a deafening crash. Subject Zero was here. The monster arrives. The creature tore through the door, its massive, distorted frame filling the entryway. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, and it let out an ear-splitting roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the asylum. Keep going. Sean shouted to Melissa as he grabbed a length of rusted pipe from the floor. What are you doing? Melissa cried, her fingers frantically working the controls. Buying you time. Sean yelled. He charged at the creature, swinging the pipe with all his strength. The blow landed against Subject Zero's shoulder, but it didn't even flinch. With a single swipe of its elongated arm, it sent Sean flying across the room. Sean! Clara screamed, running to his side. I'm fine, Sean groaned, struggling to his feet. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes burned with determination. Just keep it busy. Clara grabbed a heavy wrench from the floor and stood between the creature and Melissa. She raised it defensively, her hands trembling. Stay back, she shouted, though her voice was weak. Subject Zero tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. It lunged at her with terrifying speed, but Sean tackled it mid-charge, knocking it off balance. Shutting down the core. Meanwhile, Melissa worked feverishly at the control panel. The system was ancient and uncooperative, but she finally found the power override sequence. Almost there, she shouted, her hands shaking as she typed in the final command. The room began to vibrate as the core's light pulsed erratically. A warning alarm blared, and the screens around them flashed with red text. Containment breach imminent. System shutdown in progress. It's working. Melissa cried. The asylum itself seemed to scream in protest. The walls groaned and cracked, and the floor trembled beneath their feet. A sacrifice. Subject Zero roared, its focus shifting from Clara to Melissa. It lunged toward her, its claws outstretched, but Sean intercepted it again, grabbing the creature by its arm and holding on with everything he had. "Melissa, finish it," he shouted, his voice strained. The creature flung him aside like a rag doll, but the distraction gave Melissa the seconds she needed. She slammed her hand down on the final switch, and the core's glow dimmed before vanishing entirely. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the asylum began to collapse. The final escape. "Run!" Melissa screamed, grabbing Clara and pulling her toward the door. They found Sean slumped against the wall, barely conscious. Clara hooked her arm under his and helped him to his feet. Together, they fled down the collapsing hallway, dodging falling debris and the crumbling walls. Behind them, Subject Zero let out one final, blood-curdling roar before the ceiling caved in, burying it beneath tons of rubble. The trio burst out of the main entrance just as the entire asylum collapsed behind them in a cloud of dust and debris. They collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air and staring at the ruins of the building that had nearly consumed them. "It's over," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. Melissa nodded, though a nagging doubt lingered in her mind. "I hope so."